I feel like it's weird because it happened on Easter Saturday for Orthodox Easter Saturday. And I really feel like I didn't get Pascha. Like there's no Easter this year. That's kind of how it feels. And I'm still kind of in the cave, you know, I'm still down. We're still kind of down in that cave. And so that's kind of how it feels. But yeah, at the same time, it's been amazing. You know, it's been amazing. It's been amazing to see all these people that have supported us financially. So many messages, prayers, people, you know, that's been just astounding for me. Very touching and encouraging, just wants you to not crumble and just keep going. And so, and I'm not a very practical person, which is one of my, you know, like
really,
because I'm a carver, they think that I'm a practical guy, but no, I can carve the most precise little miniature, but if I cut the board for my carving, I'll make half an inch mistake. Like that's how it is for me. So now, like, going back, I was just there yesterday and then a few days ago, stripping more stuff from my workshop, you know, putting up fans and then decontaminating with all these chemicals and stuff. It's just so counter nature to me. It's good for me, but I really have to kick myself to get to something like that.
Now, is it settled that you can move back into that area? And
we have a catch-22 situation. It's that we actually probably have to go back because what happens is the government usually, the law that was passed a few years ago was that if you're flooded and it's a floodable area, like it's a lake that floods your house, and if you have the government will not let you rebuild. Or if you accept a certain amount to rebuild, then if it floods again, they won't give you anything. So they'll give you an amount. It's like a set amount. It ends up being maximum 250,000 Canadian, and you leave. That's it. You demolish your house, you're gone. Right. But because there's so many people flooded, and because it was a dike, they made us into an exception. So they've said, although it will be considered floodable area, although all of this is true, we're giving you the right to still go back and rebuild. And you have to do it fast because in 6 months, then you won't be allowed to rebuild the way that you've rebuilt.
Wow. And
so, which means that now we had our kids in the basement, and so they'll be in a floodable area. Like it'll be considered floodable from now on. It's like we were living in an imaginary world. So we don't want to put our kids back in the basement, but now we can't leave. We have to go back. And we have a very small house, and 2 of the rooms were in the basement, and we have 3 kids. So anyway, so now the only option we have is to put a second floor on our house because we have to go back, and we can't sell. No one's going to want to buy that house for at least 5-6 years.
Right.
And so it's like, so that's what we're looking at. And I mean, thankfully, we've had some help. The GoFundMe was pretty successful, so that'll be like a nice starting point to be able to do that. But I probably, and also, I've always been debt averse my whole life, so I have a very, very small mortgage. Like, it's ridiculous how little my mortgage is, so I can probably borrow on my mortgage and then rebuild. So, you know.
Wow.
Yeah.
But it's even the dislocation. You know, these things work in us in weird ways. And so I continue to pray for you and your family.
Thank you. I keep telling people, though, this is not the first time we were evacuated. We've been evacuated several times. But not the same. This is more like our kids are older, and we also have to deal with their emotional thing. You know, before that, it was like us, we had to deal with it, and we had some very, very small kids. They didn't know what was going on. It's like they were just on this trip traveling or whatever.
Right.
But now we can see our little youngest daughter who just breaks out crying because she misses her house. And I realized, she's actually never lived anywhere else.
Yeah.
I've lived many places. I've lived all over the map, but she's never lived anywhere else. So her attachment to that house is way deeper than mine.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's been something that I've discovered, which has been touching, but also kind of, okay, so I need to take this seriously. Like, I can't just I can't just treat this house like it's just an object. I realize,
Right.
oh, so there's history here. I need to also consider that with my kids, at least deal with it, talk to them, and no matter what happens, but we're telling them that house that we lived in is gone. I mean, although we're probably going to go back there, it's not going to be that house. It's going to be something else. It's going to have to. So
For a child, that is a whole different thing than it is for you and your wife.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So, but that's life in this world, and
yeah, exactly.
That will be something for your kids and this will be a major event for your children in their lives. It'll be something that they'll always think about, and it will reshape them as they grow up. This will be something that for good and for ill, both usually.
And luckily we have, we take the time to sit together and talk about it and explore, and so I think the kids feel like they're part of the discussion at least. So, but it's so weird. It's like when you're going through that, and then you look around and you see, I mean, I look at Jordan, what Jordan's going through, and it's crazy, and so you think, okay, life, you always have to remember that, like Jordan always says, no matter how bad it is, it could always get worse.
Yeah.
So you really have to approach things in a different way. So, and Jordan has been, it's crazy. I mean, right in the midst of, him being at the hospital every day and everything, he'd write me little notes and say, how are you doing? How's your family doing? And I'm like, Jordan, you don't have to write me. You've got your own thing to deal with. It's okay. Anyways, yeah.
I had sent him a note and just expressing my concern and telling him that I was praying for him, and he wrote back, and I just, you don't have to write me back.
It's okay.
He's a very caring individual, and that comes through, and how many of the times when he breaks down, when he talks about people coming up to him, expressing what gratitude, what he's done for them. So.
Yeah.
But it's a number of years ago when I got sick as a pastor of doing little series, which is sort of the Protestant way. And so I started just preaching through the Bible serially, and which allows deep dives into books of the Bible. And one of the things that I came out with was this little phrase that I plague my congregation with, which is the age of decay. Because that is the biblical sense of what we live in. We live in the age of decay. That isn't reality, but it's the age we live in. It's the governing paradigm we live within, and that's a deeply troubling thing for us. That houses go, relationships go, things we build go, and so it's. And it comes to all of us. None of us get out of this world alive.
That's right. Exactly. So how about you? How are things? How's I keep being astounded at how many videos you're able to put up. And and now what's great is I can actually watch the videos of the people that I know, which is intense. So I saw you talk to Sevilla, and then you talked to Jean-Philippe, who's been part of my little inner group that we meet every month, and we talk for about an hour, just a small group of us, like the top patrons. And we have this little seminar going. And I was really happy that you talked to him, because I really feel like he's very perceptive and very sharp. So that was good.
He was so much fun to talk to. No, it's been, I mean, the last year and a half since I started the videos, it's been crazy, but it's been terrific ministry. We just had a meetup last night. I've had a whole bunch of meetups and stuff lately, so my throat's a little worn out, I guess. But so Benjamin Boyce was in town yesterday.
You wrote and told me that Benjamin came. So how did that go?
That went great. We had fun. We recorded some video yesterday afternoon. Took him out for dinner with my wife. And so we got to meet my wife, and then we had a meetup at church, 2 meetups, 2 days in a row, which just because of scheduling, and just, it's so funny because we have these meetups, and most of the people who come are atheists, but they're as surprised as I am that here they are sitting in church, and, God, they're not as dismissive of the whole thing anymore. don't believe, but they're just kind of curious about the whole thing. And one atheist last night, it was after the meeting. So we have the regular meeting and then the after meeting, and people kind of break ups in 2s and 3s and 4s, and conversations continue. And he looked around, he says, you're starting a new church here. I said, well, it's not really a church right now, but yeah, you got all these young men. And so it's been phenomenal. And the individual conversations I've had with people, I kind of paused them for a few weeks because I've got vacation coming and I have to kind of catch up with some things.
My goodness, I imagine.
But I don't want to stop them, and I don't really want to regulate them in terms of me picking who I talk to, because the individuals that find me and share their story with me, that's been transformative for me. This whole journey has been just phenomenal. So we've been starting new meetup groups, and when Jordan kind of hit his peak, a lot of meetup groups started. A lot of those have kind of fizzled. Yeah. But my group continues to grow, and it's growing now mostly with people inviting their friends to the meetup. And so now I've got some of my pastors in the Bay Area. I'm kind of pushing them to, you should do this. And so we had another church that started a new one, and they had 20 people in their first night. And the pastor has some good skills. He's the right guy for it. And I think this will go. So it's been great.
Yeah. But at some point, maybe the name of the meetups will have to evolve. Right? It could be find some other, because like you said, Jordan kind of exploded. Now he reached his peak. Then obviously for a while, at least until something else happens, it's going to fade. I mean, maybe not, who knows? Like you keep thinking that he's reached the top of what he can agree, but he can keep going. But at some point, it's gonna, like you said, it's going to fade like a normal wave, like any wave. And so to keep the momentum going, I'm sure there are ways to rename and to rebrand the meetings, because now this whole discussion that's going on, it's pretty interesting to see John Vervaeke come in and you and myself, and then there's people like Sevilla, who's extremely intelligent and very perceptive. And so I'm seeing these people kind of pop up, and I'm thinking, Benjamin Boyce is part of that as well. And there's other peripheral people that are probably worth kind of bringing in and getting into the discussion. But I think that fostering this type of discussion at this level, that could be a good path for the future in terms of people continuing the discussion, even as Jordan kind of, moves on to something else or whatever it is that he decides to do. It would be great for the discussion to continue.
I've thought a lot about that. What are we going to name these groups? And at this point, at least still Jordan's name brings people, it's weird. It brings people together with the right disposition to have a conversation.
Yeah.
And then, like I said, now in terms of my meetup here, most of the growth is from people inviting other people, and they come and they're just, it was funny. We had a guy named Tim, who's actually Orthodox, and he's one of the guys who really wants to bring you to Sacramento one of these years with his church. And he says to me after the last meetup Sunday night, we had a little group that we decided that group was going to talk, because you split up into little groups, right. And we're going to talk about Jordan Peterson. And he's like, I've been here 4 times, and this is the first time we've talked about Jordan Peterson.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious.
But people bring up, sort of whatever's on their mind, but it always has had the nexus of religion, meaning, just a lot of people just coming to sort things out. It's a place that they feel welcome and free to pretty much ask anything, and have it be, worked on both seriously, but also, respectfully. So it's for me, I've always, there's this place in the New Testament, and I think it was in Corinthians, when the Apostle Paul runs out this hall of Tyrannus, and just a few verses, and basically you have the sense of the Apostle Paul renting out this hall, and people coming from miles around to talk with him and discuss with him, and you have a sense of kind of a Mars Hill thing where people are debating the philosophies of the day, not debating, but discussing in terms of their own personal lives. I've always dreamed to have that the church would be a place like that where people could come in and talk through their stuff.
Yeah. Wow. There's your dream come true right there.
It is. It really is. And, it's just crazy to me that, well, here's this, Canadian psychologist who would have a fit about pronouns, and somewhere along the line that would start something like that. It's incredible.
I'm one of some of the heat that I'm getting is that I'm not doing anything in French, because French is my first language. I do live in a French place. I live in Quebec, and French is the language I live in, actually. And so I'm thinking of in this fall starting some kind of meetup of some kind. I've talked to some people around me that I've seen on social media that I know are from the area, and it seems like people are interested to do that. And so I've also been thinking, like, what should I frame it Jordan Peterson or frame it meaning crisis? I'm not sure. Like I'm trying to think of it, but I'll probably start doing something in French at least in the fall, because I have so many prejudices about Quebec, about where I live. It's horrible. Like, I really have this idea, like, it's horrible. What I'm going to say is really horrible, but I really have this sense like it's totally lost. It's finished. It's all over here. So what's the point? What's the point in even talking to people around me, which is so stupid. It really is an emotional, like a very emotional, irrational thing that I've developed. So I have to kind of reconcile myself. And it's interesting because this village where I'm staying, we stayed here because we had friends who were selling people we knew were selling their house, and we ended up being able to get the house for a while. And now I'm discovering that this village has this massive historical, cultural importance, and it's almost been forgotten by the French Canadians. There's right next door to my house, there's one of the most famous singers in Quebec, who's like a very elderly man, but he was really, important part of the developing kind of Quebec culture. And down the street, there's a house of another poet, Félix Leclerc, who is extremely known. And so now I'm learning that all these poets and artists lived around this village. And so I don't know, it's connecting me. I don't know how. It's irrational, but it's kind of connecting me a little bit to my roots and giving me more desire to do some things in French and to talk to French Francophone people.
It's the providence of God.
Yeah.
That's how, I tell people, people, Americans like to imagine that God is somehow this, as C.S. Lewis said, this benevolent grandfather. It's like, oh no, God, when he wants to do something, he can play rough, and he can flood your house. He can, I'm curious how much of this crisis that Jordan sort of, the man in the moment kind of found each other. How much of this is really tied to the English-speaking world? And so for then the French-speaking world, how will this be different? I'm really curious.
I'm really curious too, because for sure there's something very English-speaking about Jordan, this whole intellectual dark web thing, this whole Enlightenment, David Hume thinking. It's just very English. This idea of the individual, the way that Jordan frames the individual, it's very, very English. And so I am also curious to see how it's going to, at least, I don't know, how this question is going to be asked in French circles. For sure, the people that have been coming to me now, just recently, I've had people kind of coming to me, and now maybe I might even be going to France and doing some things in Europe. It's been mostly the symbolism part that they've been interested in, and kind of recovering a coherent worldview and recovering a kind of symbolic approach to life. So that's been, but the Jordan Peterson stuff, I haven't met a lot of French speaking people who have been interested in it. So I don't know if it doesn't totally connect. There's something about it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Strange.
There've been a fair number of Dutchmen. When Jordan went to the Netherlands, he had a fairly good sized audience, but the Netherlands, they're such a small country and their English is so good that they seem to tend to follow the English culture quite a bit.
Yeah, I've had a lot of Swedes write me, a lot of people from Sweden. And so it seems like, yeah, in the northern parts for sure, Jordan is having an impact. So I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because in his 12 rules for life, he didn't come to Montreal. And I think CAA did their homework. Like the CAA probably did their homework, and they realized that it just wasn't the place. Like he wouldn't be able to draw the type of crowd that he can draw in Toronto and in other Canadian cities. That's what I think. Maybe not. I hope it's not secret French hostility.
I know Montreal or I know Quebec and the rest of Canada have a very special.
We have some disagreements. Yeah, some disagreements.
But he lived for a while in Montreal.
He did. McGill is his. That's his alma mater. That's where he did his first degree. So he's attached to Montreal. So I was surprised why he didn't come to do the 12 rules for life. But I'll have to ask him one day.
So where do you think this meaning crisis conversation is going, Jonathan?
I'm excited to see. I'm definitely excited to see, and it's really pushing me also to talk about things, frame them differently, and I'm realizing that's really interesting. And I think it's the same for you, where certain questions that are perennial that you've been asking or that you've been talking about, but all of a sudden, because there's this discussion, you get the people of Rebel Wisdom, and you have John Vervaeke, and then you have other people talking about the more spiritual part of it, you could say, or the deeper questions. You have people like Ben Shapiro and Jordan who are having these discussions as well. So I think that it's forcing us to reframe the way we're talking about it so that we can come to actually discuss. And so, I always tell people, even the word consciousness, that's not, the church fathers don't use the word consciousness. But I think it's a perfectly appropriate word to use because we all know what it means. When you use the word soul, no one knows what that word means anymore. It's ruined, And so I think that to me, the consciousness question is going to be the one I think that's going to be the most interesting to kind of get to. And the problem of consciousness, the problem of how the relationship between consciousness and existing within a narrative, I think that's the key. That's the key that's going to unlock a lot of problems. And I hope that that's what, and that's the thing that John Vervaeke and I that's our little disagreement. I mean, it's not a disagreement. It's just, we know that we're on two sides of that question. And hopefully we'll have some chances to talk about it. There's a group in Ontario that want to invite both of us to do like a public thing. And so I think that'll be interesting. And also to present, to me, it's also been about rediscovering some aspects of the Christian faith that have been forgotten or lost. That's why I have chosen certain writers or certain saints to talk about in order to bring out the more cosmic aspect, the aspect which is related to transformation, to mystical experience, something akin to consciousness, although like I said, they don't use that word. I think that's the key too. The Saint Ephrem, Saint Maximus, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, there's some writers that really give us a perspective on these questions that we're having today. And they've been a little bit sidelined because people had other issues that were concerning them. But now it seems like it's right in there, it's right in the fray. So
I had I find so many fruitful questions come from interactions with quote unquote regular people. I had a woman in my Sunday school class ask me Sunday, she said, I just heard a preacher that said, forgiving yourself is not in the Bible. And because that's a big mantra right now in a lot of evangelical, you got to forgive yourself. And I thought about it. I thought, no, he's right. You don't find that in the Bible. And then I thought, part of the reason you don't find it in the Bible is that these subtle relationships we have with consciousness, with how we imagine the self. I mean, some of these things have continued to change, and we don't notice the changes until, something comes up and it's like, well, look at this. It's like, oh. And I think you're right, that the focus on consciousness might be a substitute for the meetup title for a Jordan Peterson thing. Although that will bring fascinating other interested parties into the conversation, as you well know.
A lot more psychedelic
Oh,
conversations. Like, who thought we would be having conversations about psychedelics? I mean, would you imagine, like, 3 years ago that you would be talking to people and that's what you would be talking about? For me, that was not was not on my radar at all.
No, that totally took me, and it's so many of the people I was talking to had been in that realm, and it's like, how did I get here?
And then when we started talking about it, the biggest surprise that I've had was meeting people in my church who said, "Oh yeah, I converted after a psychedelic experience." I'm like, "What? I didn't know. I had no idea that. I had never heard that before."
Well, they're not going to cough that up in
No,
church.
they're not going to say it just straight up. So,
no, it's true. So I agree. I've been so, yeah, this whole thing has taken such interesting turns, and I think it will continue to take interesting turns. I think a piece of it is that what a lot of people knew towards the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, that materialism is pretty much played out. These things take a long time to kind of filter through a culture. And I think we're getting to that point now that more and more people will look at someone like Sam Harris and the kinds of ideas he's promoting and just say,
yeah. And and it's interesting because we had a last, the new atheist wave was like this last caricatural resurgence of that movement. It was a lot shallower than, someone like Nietzsche or the hardcore, these kind of philosophical atheists that you find in the end of the 19th century. And so you have this kind of caricatural moment where everybody is somewhat seduced by it. All these people, they went all the way into that. At least Harris talks about consciousness, and it's talking about a little bit about first person experience. But people like Dawkins, for example, completely oblivious to any of that, ignores completely the fact that he's a person in space who has an experience. That's not even, it's like he's abstracted himself from the world and thinks that he's looking at it through this objective scientific lens. And so I think that as that caricature comes to its end, then it's an opportunity. Like it ends up being a great opportunity because suddenly, and you see it, I'm sure you've seen it too. You see people, you see it in their eyes that they've understood that secret. It's almost like a magic thing that was just veiled in front of them. They couldn't see it. They just couldn't understand what was significant about that. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, wait a minute. What do I do with consciousness? Like, even if I try to encompass it back into the scientific system, then it creates very strange things because it's like, okay, so I'm, how does it can't just be this thing atop that we ignore, pretend that it's just, we take it for granted. All of a sudden it has to be dealt with. And so that's been to me the most fascinating thing, is to watch people understand that. And so then it's like, okay, now you have that, you've had that glimpse, you've had that awakening moment. Okay, now let's take you step by step. I'm going to take you step by step and show you what that means. What it means in terms of what a story is, what it means in terms of what a frame for reality is, what it means in terms of necessity of hierarchy. All these things are going to come back in.
Yeah.
Right? And then I'm going to show you in the Christian story why things are the way they are. Like, why is it that we talk about things the way we do? Because that's the normal world, right? The normal world is the world in which the first thing that you encounter is this conscious experience of being, and then on top of that you can add, the rationalization. You can add this analytic mode. It's fine, but that's not the first. It's never the first thing.
I think it will be interesting to see. I think there's a crisis in Protestantism that, and you see this in some ways in the renewed interest to the more sacramental liturgical traditions. One of the things that I obviously can't miss is how many people coming out of the Jordan Peterson conversation are very interested in orthodoxy. And I think orthodoxy partly in America because it's unlike their vast experience with Protestants, unlike some of the corruption and chaos that has been in the news in the Roman Catholic Church. Orthodoxy is sort of the new kid on the block. At least in this continent, they don't have their hands dirty. Yeah. They haven't had any big scandals.
We've had scandals, though. We've had scandals for sure.
Yeah, but they're not known.
You're not big, and they're not known. That's true. But I think there's a little bit of the. I always kind of joke around and think that there is in Orthodoxy enough of the foreignness, because the foreignness is dangerous, but it's also an opportunity, right? It's dangerous because it can kind of you can project into it. And you see people do it. I see it, a lot of people do it with Buddhism. It's like they just project whatever they want into Buddhism. And it's like, it's everything that I want it to be just because you don't know about it. You don't really know what it is. It's like, actually look at Tantric Tibetan Buddhism and you might be surprised at what you find. But anyways, and so I think that Orthodoxy has enough of the foreign to attract the attention, to kind of titillate and, kind of surprise, because we're other things are banal, but it's Christian, it can connect you back to your origin also through that fascination and through that kind of surprise. Hopefully it can connect you back to the Western story too, so that's what I get that sense a little bit. So I don't know, tell me a bit more about how you've seen it.
Well, I see this as a crisis. So I've been reading more in about the Reformation lately, and paying particular attention to these turns of consciousness. And so, what happened a lot with Luther is this sacramental system that medieval Roman Catholicism had, continued to work. There was so much corruption that on one hand, that was clearly a complaint against the church, all the corruption that was happening, which Protestantism forced the church to have to address. But then also with Luther, there was this change in terms of the relationship between faith and consciousness, that faith became very much of a psychological reality, much more than an embedded reality in terms of materiality. And I mean, you see this with all of the different changes that happens with Protestantism. An individualism comes into play in Protestantism, and these things happen slowly because people don't just change overnight with this. And Luther, who's at the center of it, I mean, the chaos he unleashes surprises him, because Karlstadt, who was right there with him, goes off into the radical, and it's basically spawns the radical Reformation. And so chaos ensues. But, one of the things that I see now, I was having a conversation with other people in the Christian Reformed Church, because obviously the same-sex marriage debates are just running through Protestant denominations, and they're having to wrestle with it. But one of the things I noted to actually a Canadian scholar in the Christian Reformed Church is that in some ways this, when Protestants basically say, using the Bible as such is supposed to resolve any question that comes to the church. And what has happened with the questions about women's ordination, the questions about same-sex marriage, is that Protestants are basically, they've given up looking to the Bible to resolve these questions. Now, however people feel about these questions in the Bible, I'm going to push that aside. What's interesting to note is that the Protestant vision was that here with the Bible, we can answer any question. And Protestants are giving up on that.
Yeah.
And so then you have to ask, well, what of Protestantism? And they're kind of in this point where it doesn't seem they can go back to Catholicism. And so, okay, if the Bible can't resolve this with respect to the community, where do we go? And so I think we see a continued crisis within Protestantism. And I think if if in the Reformation we saw a turning from an embedded sacramental vision of a universe made whole that the sacramental system was supposed to embody into a much more psychological phase, just like we're seeing the end of materialism, we're seeing the end of that merely psychological for Protestantism. And so in this new phase, which I think is going to attempt to re-embed consciousness and materiality in one coherent picture, that's, Protestantism has been an effect of this division. And so then what do Protestants do? And I think that's a completely unanswerable question at this point.
Right. Yeah. What's the solution? And I think that it's interesting because in terms of the Bible, I've been thinking about this for quite a while, because when I was young, I was in a very conservative, Protestant denomination. I was a kind of conservative Baptist, and it was all the Bible, like you said. It was like the Bible, and I had no notion of liberal Protestants. Like I had no idea. Like I never. But then when I finally discovered this whole, Episcopalian kind of direction, I realized Protestants both, let's say, affirm the Bible, as the Word of God, that kind of language. And then they're also the ones who destroyed the Bible. They did both. And there's something about doing one which leads to the other, I think. I was having the discussion with a Protestant Reformed pastor a while ago, where he kept saying the Word of God, the Word of God. And I was like, the Word of God is Christ. And I was like, I tried to get him to get back to that. And it's like, because if the Word of God is, or at least if you have this idea that when you say Word of God in terms of the Bible, it's somehow equivalent to when you're saying the divine logos, like in that sense, then that's going to break apart, because the Bible itself is a garment. It's a garment of skin. It's an outer covering. And so because of it's a material thing. Like it's a series of words and letters and phrases, and because of it can be broken apart. It has to be held by something above it. It has to be held by the Holy Spirit. It has to be held by the unity of the church. It has to be held by the unity of the faithful in the Spirit of God, or else it's going to start to fragment. It's going to start to be poked at, and even in the very desire to prove its validity in a kind of materialist way, that you're going to destroy it. And it seems like that's what happened, where all these scholars and scientists who wanted to prove that the Bible was this and that and this started to scratch at it, the details of it, finding these little loopholes and holes, and this text isn't like this old manuscript isn't like this one, and there's differences between the manuscripts, and wait a minute, and this whole section we don't have in this manuscript, and all of a sudden it's like and finally you end up with the Bible that has all these little different color, like little paraphrases and little notes, like this text is not in so many manuscripts and stuff. It's like, that's not a Bible. You can't, at least don't use those Bibles in your church, because that'll destroy your church. Have a Bible that has all these notes in them. Anyways, so it's an interesting, and I think that ultimately it's not the sacramental system, right? It's not the sacramental system. It's more seeing the unity of the church and the Holy Spirit as being the first place where God encounters the person, right? Pentecost comes before the Bible, right? Pentecost precedes the Bible. And we tend to see it in terms of systems, like in terms of bishops and whatever, and like you said, like different sacraments. But at least in the Orthodox tradition, we tend to talk about sacramentality in general. Not so much, not that the sacraments are important. Of course they're important, but there's a kind of a joke that people talk about, where when the Eastern fathers encountered the Latins for the Council of Florence, I think it's in the 1400s, the Catholics asked the Orthodox how many sacraments there are, and the Orthodox were like, what do you mean how many sacraments there are? And they're like, there's 7 sacraments. They're like, what do you mean there's 7? They didn't understand the question. Right. It was like, sacramentality is just a whole process of how we exist in the world and how our existence in the Holy Spirit transforms reality and how it transforms things. And so it's as much the prayers, it's as much it's the object in terms of the icons and the prayer and the church and all that, but then it's also the manner in which we live together, like that we exist together as a communion of saints. So it's a bigger thing, it's a bigger thing than the system of sacramentality. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Well, and Protestants have always had this propensity to divinize the scriptures and kind of, so you have the Father, Son, and Holy Scriptures as your Trinity instead of, well, this is what's happened in Protestantism again and again. And I think part of it was in the West, in a sense, so quite clearly in the Reformation, Scripture replaces the 7 sacraments, and the Bible itself becomes the only sacrament. And you see that in the in both what happens to baptism, which right away you have a big fight over baptism, because the understanding of what baptism is and how it functions divides in the Protestant church, and then with the Eucharist, like in a similar way, it splits. And so you have Calvin with his real presence, who's trying to maintain some sense of sacrament, and you have the Zwinglian tradition that says, well, it's sort of a symbol, it's a sign, but it's nothing really happens. And so again, you see that it's just bound up with these deep assumptions that theological language attempts to express and philosophical language attempts to explain. But then the way the Bible then gets handled, one of the things that I noted when I was in seminary, even in the 80s, was that for a long time in the West, the church wanted to make theology a science, okay? A science in the new sense of the term science, not scientia.
Medieval sense,
Right, a science, and then the Bible then was, just like for a chemist, chemicals would be the thing that the chemist works on. Right. For a theologian, the Bible is the thing that we take apart.
Yeah.
And all of this had its, a lot of it had its beginnings in Erasmus, when Erasmus of Rotterdam comes and looks at the Vulgate, looks at Jerome's Vulgate, and begins to more and more Greek texts are around. And so he begins to look at, well, why is this? And there's this whole movement that's saying, no, the Holy Spirit inspired Jerome to write the Vulgate as such. And see, right there, you have the beginning of of this
the
thing.
King James, I remember people telling me that the King James version is inspired, like it's inspired by God.
Well, that's exactly right. And so you see this happen again and again in the West. They're approaching the Bible. Now I think what's going to be interesting is, so when John Vervaeke and I spoke, we had a conversation last week, so when I listened, so it was very interesting listening to Sevilla, because she's talking about Vervaeke and you, and I'm kind of watching this and saying, wow, she's seen some things in between the two of you, and this question of return. And I, when I think about what's next, I don't know where Protestants have in some ways, ever since the Reformation, been to work off your current situation. They've in a sense been homeless in some ways. And so they've been kept trying to establish homes. And they're going to build their own homes in typical Protestant fashion. Nobody else got this right except us and our little group. So I don't know what this new turning that we're seeing now will mean for Protestants. If clearly many are going back to, but in some senses. I had one colleague say to me, if the East and Rome ever make up, I'm in.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, the great schism then comes into play in that I don't know if I can go back to Rome or the East,
Yeah.
because they can't get their act together.
Yeah, for sure. That is definitely, I don't see it, to be honest, in the eschaton. It's the only way to see it. But I want to come back to the sacramentality question. My question to you is, let's say now with this kind of new perspective on consciousness and on patterns, let's say on patterning, and how how it's inevitable that there's patterning in our human engagement, patterning in the way we frame the world, frame our narratives, all of that. If I would say something like that there's a hint of sacramentality in a handshake, like, could you see that could then be in a hierarchy of sacramentality,
Yes.
which would lead to communion, which would lead to the Eucharist as, let's say, the anchor of the world, something like that, or the anchor of the church. But then that also then filters down and it helps us also then to understand how we are constantly engaging in symbolic, in the sense of condensing, right? In symbolic actions amongst each other, but then also when we frame our own story, our own narrative, we're acting in this kind of symbolic way, and all of that has a ultimately sacramental process.
Yes.
We were talking about, this is something that someone asked me in a Q&A once at an event, actually, and it really struck me when they said it, because I knew it, but it's one of those things where it was formatted in the right way, when they said, if you do like Christ says, which is, if you see the good in the other, and you always looking for the good in the other, and you're always looking for Christ in the person in front of you, won't that then transform reality for you? Won't that actually make it, if you participate in that and you let yourself go and you actually don't look at people's faults, those faults in a certain manner will be diminished. They'll be lower in the hierarchy of attention, you could say. And in the hierarchy of attention, as you're engaging with others, the world will actually become more glorious. It will fill up with light. And you see that because you see people who, everything they look at, they always look at the negative. They always see the negative thing, no matter what it is, because it's always there. It's inevitably there. It just depends on how you structure it in that kind of hierarchy of attention. So to me, that explaining it that way, to me, is a way to say, this is what sacramentality is about. It's about that, but then it also does include baptism, marriage, all these gestures that we pose, because they're the most condensed version. And if you take baptism, for example, it's like, that's the story. This is it. This is the go down into the water, go down and get the spark. You go down into the water, you leave your dead garments, and you come out, vested in Christ. And so it's like, that's it. Doing that actually is a transformative thing. It's not just it's not some woo-woo magic. It's like, it actually, that's how the world works, through those types of gestures. It's just, this one is so condensed and symbolic. But every time you like I said, like every time you shake someone's hand or you say hello or you do that, you're participating in the same process.
Right. And actually, the conversation I had with Benjamin Boyce yesterday very much touched on. He has the recording, so I don't know when it'll come out.
Okay.
But this is exactly where we went, because he's working on his own journey, and so he picks at you and me and Vervaeke at that end of it, as opposed to the two other themes that he works on in his channel. And he asked, well, where can we? So when I listen to people like Benjamin and many other people I talk to, they always focus on, well, where can I find this experience? And what they're sort of saying is that they're imagining that this experience is going to be something akin to, again, a psychedelic trip. And that somehow in this special experience, that's somehow where I will meet God. And so I gave him the Isaiah passage where Isaiah is in the temple and the seraphim are there, and they cry out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." And I said, you will encounter God. You walk into Yosemite Valley and everyone's like, "Oh, well, there's his glory." And I said, even after a meetup, we finish our 2 hours and then we take our little picture, and I do that to kind of break the group out of the table. And then they all break down, and I stand in the church and I watch clusters of 2, 3, or 4 people having clearly meaningful conversation. I say, well, I see his glory there. And in fact, I think I love the way you phrased it, because it is sacramentality. We see him all over the place, and it's in a handshake. It's in the child. It's in my encounters with the homeless. It's not a separate, here I'm going to go into a trance or take a psychedelic drug, and in this special little place, that's where I see God, because he's not everywhere else. No, he is and this is where I get, you mentioned we should talk about God 1 and God 2. God 1 is the whole earth is full of his glory. There's you keep bumping into him, not just when you're, when chemicals are rushing, illuminating your brain and you're in some ecstatic state. You bump into him with the embrace of your wife, with, and even that, I'm elevating it too far, with sitting down for a meal, and all throughout. And so this is part of what I think this is a function of the question of consciousness and materiality. And that we have said, well, spirituality is this unique set of things over here. And no, not just when you're on a psychedelic, or not just when you're in a service and sort of flushed with the majesty and the beauty, or if you're Pentecostal, when the Holy Spirit descends on you. Not just those places, but that then triggers people in terms of the pantheist conversation, because when they hear that, then they say, well, God is everything. And like, no, that's not it either. And well, why can't you just tell me? Well, I don't know.
Like you said, the idea that the earth is full of his glory, I think that's it. Like, that's the way to see it, that the glory of God fills, upholds, is the secret behind everything. It's the thing that's hidden in the world, and if you, with the right eye, you can encounter it. And I think that there are, if you read there is the possibility of a deeper transformation. You see it. I mean, if you read the lives of the saints, you do have this idea of a kind of illumination, that they are transformed, that their life is transformed, that they participate in God's nature, that it is a kind of ecstasy, a kind of a kind of rapture. But that doesn't just come to you. Like, it's not an experience that you go somewhere to get. It's something that you encounter through a life of prayer, of contrition, of confession, of all these and of loving your neighbor, and living in the life of God. Then you approach those moments. If something like that is just given to you, I think that there's something counterfeit about it. There's something dangerously counterfeit about it. And the church fathers and the modern fathers, they warn us about kind of pseudo spirituality, this simplistic experiential spirituality that you just have these experiences. And if an experience doesn't transform you, doesn't make you love your neighbor more, it's pretty useless. I mean, it might be fun, but that's not the point, right? There's something, it's supposed to transform you.
Well, and I think, what happens with a saint is, if a Protestant may use that word, the point of Protestantism,
dangerous territory here.
Right. But the point of Protestantism is that sainthood is not for a special class of people over there. Sainthood is God's desire for all of us. And I'm sure you've had this experience too, when you meet someone who has, at least in your estimation and in your experience, achieved a degree of sainthood, you begin to notice that for them, the world is very alive. And the world is very alive with God. And it isn't just with these separate experiences. I think actually the drive to locate God only with certain kinds of elevated experiences or flow states, or however we might want to say it, is part of this instrumentality that I think is at the heart of the meaning crisis.
Yeah.
Owen Barfield, who's a very interesting guy, wrote about this quite a bit in the middle of the 20th century. And one of the points that he made was the degree to which we explain is exactly the degree to which we lose meaning. And I think what's the key thing in that is, in a sense, our instrumentality, because the desire that we have for mastery of nature is directly related to our ego, if that's the right term, or our consciousness's desire to, I think, live idolatrously, which means that we are going to turn the entire world into our slave.
Yeah.
So that we can secure for ourselves the outcomes, the experiences, the patterns we wish, instead of actually receiving the patterns, God's patterns. It's the heart of the rebellion in the garden.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think that's, the whole self-help culture, all of that stuff is exactly what you're saying. And a lot of modern, this kind of California Buddhism is that as well. There's this like, I'm going to meditate. I'm going to do these different things. It's just like a technique. I'm going to do it so that I have more energy. I feel better. I'm happier, whatever. And so there is this kind of instrumentality, like you said. And I think that's maybe, that's interesting, because that is something that I think when we talk about the problem of the meaning crisis, and it was interesting because I kept seeing that that's what Bishop Barron was trying to talk to Jordan Peterson about, but Jordan just wasn't on his horizon. He kept trying to bring it back to worship. He was saying, it's worship. That's the key. Key is it's what do you celebrate? That's how it starts. It's like, what are the things that we celebrate? And that comes way before all the other questions of, like you said, this idea of I'm going to use this technique or this technique to achieve this goal in my life or whatever. The first question is what we celebrate. And that's something that I thought that the fact that he kept wanting to bring it back is like, it's about worship. It's about worship. It's so hard for people to understand that the attitude of gratitude and the attitude of celebration, of worship, that's the first ground to reality. And that's the only way that you don't make God an instrument. You don't make God into something that you're going to use to get what you want, is true worship and true, like, recognize your place, like, know where you are and elevate, celebrate that which is beyond you.
I think the difficulty that Jordan and almost everyone I talk to has when we try to lay this out as we usually do, what people hear is, okay, well, this means that it's, if your orientation is instrumental, all you see are tools. And this is deep in what Jordan, I think, articulates very well, in that which is in us, we are looking out at the world with a perspective, and that perspective shapes the world that we see. And so if we see ourselves as consumers, if we see ourselves as masters of the world, everything we see is a tool. And then when you come to someone and say, well, right worship, what they hear is the church as a tool by which I can find meaning in my life, find happiness in my life. And so they go to church as a tool and thinking about the church as a tool. Now the church is going to provide these kinds of things for me. And then they go into church with that attitude and, well, it doesn't work because
it doesn't work. Exactly.
And that's exactly, so if you talk to people who have, given up on the whole thing, well, they will tell you again and again, it didn't work.
Right.
Whereas when I listen to you and Bishop Barron and how I know you to be, you don't go to church because, well, I've gosh, my house just got flooded. Maybe I wasn't praying hard enough to keep the flood waters apart. And so now I'm going to go to church to give, to get my blessing. Yeah. And in a sense, because of this consumer, and it's way even before the consumer, this instrumental approach, because it's the heart of idolatry, that they can't help but turn church into an idol. Whereas in a sense, you don't go, you certainly go to worship to have yourself reoriented by God.
Yeah. That's a good way to say it.
Right. You don't go to church in order to, well, shoot, I better go to church because my wife needs straightening out and my kids need this and I need more money. I mean, you don't do that.
Yeah. I'm sure I do sometimes.
Well, yeah, there's a part of us in there.
I was going to say, it's like, I don't know. There's sometimes where it's like, because the thing is, the thing that happens is that the lower aspects that you mentioned, this idea of finding some kind of stability, finding some kind of relief, even in terms of confession or finding legitimacy or there's all these things that actually you do end up getting. But like you said, it's that, but you'll only get them if you don't look for them, if you don't look for that. And that's true about so many things in life, right? It's true about so many things. Like, it's like, if you go into a friendship only thinking about what it's going to give you, then you're going to get a lot less out of that friendship than if you go into a friendship with a kind of open desire to connect with someone and to have a communion with a human person. Then the gratitude, the lower aspects, you're actually going to get way more, and Christ always says that all the time. He's like, don't worry about the things of this world. If you focus on God, if you celebrate if you celebrate God, if you live in the kingdom of God, then you'll get those things. Don't worry. They'll be there. Like, that's not the point. That's not the point of life.
Well, and I think what happens in the Enlightenment is we're so impressed with our success at being intentional scientific consumers that we have been able to achieve electricity, levees, flood insurance, air conditioning. We have been so impressed by this. But Jesus says, if you gain the whole world but lose your psyche, I mean, I think what Jesus is saying right there is basically he's saying, here's the meaning crisis for you. You've made an exchange.
Yeah, exactly.
You are living comfortable consumer lives with air conditioning and all of these things, but you've lost your soul.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to hear people wonder, and you hear people, it's like, why is it that we have all these great material things, but our society, the social fabric is eroding? I don't understand. It's like, wait a minute, didn't Jesus tell you? Like, hasn't it just been one of the presuppositions about the basis of Western civilization, that if we focus ourselves on those, those smaller things, then we'll lose the higher one. It's like you have to orient yourself properly.
Well, and I think for both of us, we had experiences earlier in our life of going and living with very poor communities. And one of the things that would happen is North Americans would come to the Dominican Republic and they would meet the Haitians and the Dominicans, sort of like, touring, going on safari with, we're going to experience some Haitians. And one of the things that the Americans come through and say, they're so happy. Now, first of all, they're polite and they're hospitable, so they're not gonna, here's a stranger, let me tell you about all the troubles I have in life. No, they're people with social skills, so they don't do that. But I think that experience that wealthy North Americans have of, they're so happy, is how can a person be happy living in desperate poverty in, with none of the material success, comfort, or security that we prioritize so highly? How can they live without that and actually live normal human lives?
Yeah. No, I agree. I wanted to look, because we wanted to talk about God 1 and God 2, so I want to try to get to that before we kind of run out of breath. So maybe, because I think that maybe I'm over interpreting your God 1 and God 2, because to me, like, the way that I see it is that they're the same. Like, to me, they're and I think you think they're the same too.
Yes.
But I think that maybe, to me, I don't see them as being opposed or as being distinct. To me, one flows out of the other, in the sense that when you talk about God number 2 flows out of God number 1,
Yes.
right? And you could say something like the manner in which the infinite encounters the particular, right, is going to will necessarily look like will. It will be will. There is no other way for the infinite to encounter the particular. And so that's going to, and it's going to be adjusted. It's going to be an answer to a specific. It's not going to just be the infinite, right? It's going to be an encounter, and therefore it's going to be an answer to a prayer. It's going to be it's going to be something which seems to shift things in a way that you might not understand. It's going to be something that's going to open up things, provide opportunities. All of that is going to happen. It's going to be it's going to look like will, because that's like I said, it's only because we don't consider the idea of being or consciousness. We don't consider it. We think that it's not part of, somehow not part of the universe, that it's some epiphenomena, despite the fact that it's by that we actually understand everything. But as soon as consciousness comes back in, you could say it's the same about even you, right? That you have your person is somehow your soul or your spirit or whatever. You don't totally have access to it. It's actually something which is higher than your usual conscious self. That is something that is kind of above there. And then that will come down and express itself in specific wills, specific desires. And sometimes those can be not in communion with each other, right? They can actually be in conflict with each other because you're not united. But if you can imagine an infinite and the infinite God, then those wouldn't be in conflict. They would actually be united, and that would be God's will, and it would be God answering prayer. It would be all of that. To me, it just makes sense. It could even be miracles. It can be all this stuff that we talk about God number 2, God acting in history. To me, flows out of the God number 1 that you talk about. So I don't know if that's something, it's the way you think about it, or that makes sense to you.
I agree with everything you just said.
Okay.
And I came up with this because I was watching, I probably watched that thing 20 times, the exchange between Peterson and Sam Harris in the first Vancouver debate, because the night is wearing on and they haven't really gotten to the God question in Sam's mind. Jordan's been talking about it the whole time. Jordan knows what he's doing in that conversation.
Yeah.
He's putting together an argument, and he keeps trying to build something, and Sam is sort of keeps kicking it over with all of the usual tropes that Sam brings to these debates.
Yeah.
And so they get to the end of it, and they're like, well, we haven't talked about God. And I'm thinking, you've been talking about God the whole time. And so Sam says to Jordan, tell me what you mean by God. And Jordan sits down and begins to lay out all the ways in which this impersonal filter and the assumptions that we have, which are necessary to function psychologically, to break down a world which is far too large for our little brains to hold together and the ramifications of that for daily life. So Peterson has this, he sits down with his computer, he opens it up, says, I'm going to read these because they're so complicated, and he starts reading through them. And Sam then interrupts him and says, no, that's not God. And no, that's not what God means. And I'm thinking, well, Sam doesn't know any history, and he doesn't know any theology, and he doesn't have any understanding of holy, 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 and the whole world is full of his glory. Yeah. And so and that I think is helpful, because so in the West, and Bishop Barron and Peterson talked about this too, that God sort of gets fragmented, especially in the Protestant Reformation, and kind of blows apart. And part of this blowing apart, I was trying to articulate with God number one and God number two. In Christianity, they're obviously together. Now, you actually see towards the end of that conversation that Peterson goes to God number two when he has his sitting at the edge of his bed and going, asking this moment of repentance that he lays out for Sam Harris. But this is, in a sense, what happens in the West is when God number one and God number two kind of get pulled apart. And this happens in providential deism, where we say, well, nature is, and even when we use this word nature, nature is this thing that's separated from God. And this gets so complicated, but
especially because the word nature
right
was completely flipped around. Like that's the way we use the word nature today is the opposite of the way that it was used, traditionally. It's hilarious.
Exactly. Yeah. And so nature, so that's another thing I began paying attention to. Every time someone says nature, I think, what do they mean by that word?
Yeah.
And what they mean by that word is something without consciousness or intentionality, something mechanistic.
Yeah, there you go.
That is what nature, someone dies of natural causes as opposed to a murder. Yeah. No conscious agent willfully interfered with what we imagine to be a mechanistic playing out of the world, where there is, and only when you have that kind of view, then suddenly you can split God up and send him away. But what Jordan, in a sense, does with his God number one is he says, okay, let's give Darwin his due and say we don't need a God to make the world. But in a sense, what Jordan is saying, and I think in a deep way, is you can't have psychology without God. Well, what kind of God? Well, this God number one. But you're exactly right in that and I think this is why we see people who, and it's not conscious for them, but people are listening to Jordan, and Jordan is smuggling God into the conversation. And that is leading people to God number two, because you can't help it.
Yeah, I remember that moment in one of the Sam Harris talks where Jordan mentions this idea. He said, if you ask something, you'll get an answer. And Sam says, yeah, I've done that. It works. And it's like, but that's not God. It's like, what, where am I? Like, what world, where am I? Like, you ask and there's an answer, and therefore there's a will, there's a something presents itself to you as a formed response. You participate in that, just like you participate in your relationship, with the infinite. Obviously, it's going to manifest itself in a way that is appropriate to your frame. That's the whole idea. And so I was like, I just thought that was the strangest moment when he said, basically, it's like Sam Harris saying that he prays and he gets answers, but he doesn't like God. It's like, okay, let's just find another word if that's all that's bothering. It's just the word that's bothering you. Let's just get rid of the word, maybe.
But that is the heart of our rebellion.
Yeah.
That is in a sense Adam and Eve saying, Satan suggests, well, God doesn't have your best interest at heart. What that's saying is God isn't love and doesn't love you. And therefore, when I listen to people and I think what really is at heart of the motivation to banish God from the world. Even the psalmist, no ancient person would say there is no God, because that was just silly. What they say is God is absent, doesn't see, doesn't care, won't hold me accountable. That's what the fool says. The fool, the psalmist says in his heart. And so what I find when I listen to it, and this even comes to the complaint about Calvinism, which I hear often because I, say I'm a Calvinist, which is, what gives God the right to make decisions about me? And I hear that and I think, that's just nuts. Because tell me how you are how most of you is the product of your choices. It's so naive.
Yeah.
You didn't choose when you were born, to whom you were born. You didn't choose the genetic makeup you have. Most of your life, you don't choose. Mm-hmm. But to say, well, God somehow thinks he has the right to make decisions about my life. It's like, well, that's kind of thinking toddlers have.
God, it's because you think that God is a guy that's like you. What is that horrible song like that God's coming back home on the bus or something? Like these horrible ideas about God as just and it really comes with this whole this whole weird multi-dimensional idea, this whole idea, this horrible idea, Alex Jones types idea, where this idea that the spiritual world is like another world, like it's like another dimension, and God is like in another dimension. It's like as if God is a being, and people have lost the whole idea of principality, the whole idea of hierarchies of beings. It's all gone. It's all level,
Right.
And so they don't imagine angels as principalities. They imagine angels as just beings that are there in space, but you can't see them. And maybe you could see them, and then they could chat with you. It's like that drives me insane. And so I think that when I hear people talk about God that way, I keep getting angry, because it's exactly, it's like you're taking the lowest version of God that, like, the most uneducated person believes in, and you're arguing against that. And it's like, I don't know who you're arguing against. At least it's not me. At least it's not any of the church fathers or any of the classical theists. It's Jerry Falwell. That's horrible. I shouldn't say that. Let's bleep that out. Anyway, some is just like kind of. Anyways.
Well, but so when I was talking to Benjamin Boyce yesterday, I was saying, if you look at the 10 Commandments and you look at the commandment God gives, which this commandment alone should make people stop and say, there is something special about the Bible and this whole thing, Judaism that leads to Christianity, because when God commands, you may not make an image of me from anything that I have created. What that commandment says is, you cannot reduce me to anything that you can represent with your mind. Now, this puts us in a problem, because in order to relate to God, we need representations. And Jesus comes along and says, Father. And I thought, when Nathan Jacobs had a conversation with Hank Hanegraaff, I thought Nathan Jacobs laid that out well in terms of how the fathers talked about Father, Son, and that relationality. In other words, we need representations in order to relate. And so Jesus gives us one. Here's Father. But every such representation comes with its vulnerabilities and liabilities.
Yeah.
But right at the beginning, God says, do not represent me with a calf, with a big statue of a man, with any graven image, because once you do that, you set up exactly what you just described and exactly what we've done. And so what happens when, in a sense, God number one gets banished by Darwin, what Christians begin to do, because, oh gosh, there's way too much sunk cost in Christianity. God number two, this relational, what if God were one of us, this relational imagination, this relational representation gets expanded to fill the void. And you see this in a book, let's say like Chuck Colson's Born Again, where here's a guy all his life going to the Episcopal Church, comes home after meeting with a born-again evangelical and says, I'm a Christian. And his wife says, why have we been going to this Episcopal Church forever? I mean, what was that about? No, I know Jesus. I have a personal relationship with Jesus.
Yeah.
And so it's, in a sense, God number two expands to make up for the God number one that Nietzsche declares has been killed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, obviously I don't believe that there is this division in God, but in terms of our representations of God, this is, I think, is something that has happened in the West. And this helps us understand why Jordan Peterson lays this stuff out. Sam Harris says, oh no, that's not God who would complain about, masturbation or what you do with your body. And then they go into this interesting conversation where Jordan basically says, and I'm thinking about doing a video on this, Jordan acts as if God number two is real. And the reason and I think you laid out exactly why that can't be helped. It is the only way we can actually give God right praise.
Mm-hmm.
So that's for me, why the language of God number one and God number two, I think was helpful for explaining some of what has been happening in
understanding the where these discussions aren't connecting, like where they're not. And I think you're right, and I totally agree. And I think that because of people like Sam Harris and the preponderance of, let's say, evangelical discourse in North America, I think that in a way that's probably why also that I've talked more about your, like, the the infinite aspect of God, and this kind of this idea that like the earth is full of his glory, that type of representation. But I also think it's absolutely inevitable that will then become will, like it will become will, and will become all these things that you kind of associate with God number two. This idea that God can reveal something to you, that you can have, that God can help you, can redirect you, that God can, all this stuff is, to me, is an inevitable consequence of God number one, but also inevitable consequence of re-understanding the world through consciousness, re-understanding the world through, the supremacy of consciousness, like the fact that the filter, all of that is inevitable, so. Right.
And this is exactly what we've seen happening. And this is exactly why the celebrity atheists are just completely wrong about what happens when people give up their organized religion. And I always use this commercial that was on a few years ago from, I call her Verizon Lisa, because it's this Verizon commercial where this woman walks in front of a Verizon store and the universe told me, Lisa, you need a new smartphone. And by the way, your hair looks good today. And this is exactly what happens with people. They say, I can't believe in God. And so now they're not going to use God, but they're going to use universe.
Universe. I know, that is the most hilarious thing. It's like the universe spoke to me. It's like, dude, the universe doesn't speak. Okay, things that speak, we call them beings. We give them names. We don't use a object description for things that speak. That just doesn't make any sense. It's like my hat spoke to me. Like, your hat doesn't speak. The universe doesn't speak.
But people. I mean, and that's,
I know, it's hilarious.
Yeah, but that is exactly who we are, and that's exactly why the vision of. And Peterson gets at this with Matt Dillahunty when they start talking about his lawnmower, and Peterson knows this. The difficult thing is, and here's the problem, and C.S. Lewis nails this when he talks about pantheism, because C.S. Lewis says, what happens when you play, basically when you pray into the void and the void speaks back, and you realize, well, what if this isn't, a figment of my imagination? Mm-hmm. Well, we know we have active imaginations and we project as much as we
for sure.
But, and this is Lewis's point. What if you decide that, well, maybe universe has designs on you that, you haven't been that you haven't been asked to consent to. That in fact,
Yeah.
But this is the story of humanity, and it's right there in Genesis, and it goes all the way through. And this doesn't end, because the heart of our rebellion is that God is God and we are not, and we really hate that, because that's how we want to be. We want to control the world. We are all Sauron, looking for a way.
Yeah. And it's interesting, like my wife is amazing. I admire her because she's able, when someone says the universe and they'll say the universe, I asked the universe, whatever, she doesn't flinch at all. She just, it's like in her mind, she just replaces universe with God, and then she totally engaged with the person. I have this like little glitch where I'm like, oh, don't. Like, that doesn't mean anything. It's not how can you say, I think I had this discussion with David Fuller when he asked me about the universe, and I said, the universe, the fact that you can say that the universe is one, that you can use the word universe, that you can say all, just that, that is pointing to you to something, my friend. It's pointing you to the notion that you can unify all of manifestation. And so there's something that pops up above it. Like it just happens, universe. How can you say that? There's something above it, inevitably.
Well, and I think, for me, both you and Jordan have been extremely helpful for helping me recognize the indispensability of hierarchies. Because we all, again, once Benjamin releases the conversation we had, and he talked about the social justice thing and how, certain people are saying they're creating kind of a little island of privilege, in that what I am oppressed, instead of I think therefore I am oppressed therefore I am, or I am black therefore I am.
Yeah.
And what they have to do is establish one little space that they won't deconstruct. And it's like, well, there you go. There's your idol right there. Yeah. And the way, gosh, you guys have, I always keep this dollar bill on my thing to look at the little pyramid with the separation of, because here's the thing. Once you violate that third commandment and make the thing that cannot be deconstructed into the top of your hierarchy, you have now created a hierarchy that cannot stand.
Yeah. And you're right. And it will fragment and it will splinter inevitably. Yeah.
And you cannot actually have a community around it, because, well, I am black. Well, that means everyone who is not black can't be part of your hierarchy. Yeah. And you're going to have a supremacist structure. And I think just recognizing hierarchy is fundamental in this. Yeah. But then you get into the fact that what happens with Christ, and I realized this a number of years ago when I was going carefully through the Gospel of Luke, is Christianity is this amazingly subtle working through of equal and hierarchical. It's just back and forth. And you see Jesus. So when rebellism actually came to Living Stones, which was hierarchically a mind-blowing experience, that a British film crew would come to this church. And the one thing that Ali noted in my sermon that kind of caught his attention was, you see this with Christ, because he's at the top of the hierarchy, and he says, well, I'm at the bottom. I'm the servant of all.
Yeah. That's why I say Christ is not at the top of the hierarchy. It's not the right way. It is the right way to see it, but you also have to say that Christ fills the hierarchy. That's what he does. He's actually the entire hierarchy. So it is right to say that he's at the center, he's at the top. All of that is fine, but you need to really understand that he fills it up. He goes to the bottom too. I mean, the descent to Hades, the crucifixion, all of that is jamming the entire world into one. Crucifixion is insane. It's like jamming the entire world into one event, where the top and the bottom completely meet, where the mockery of Christ declaring him the king is an actual declaration of kingship, where it's like all of it smashed together. The story of the crucifixion is, it drives you insane if you think about it too much. But I wanted to get to this idea that you said, because I think that's one of the things that, like, for example, Jonathan Haidt gets wrong, is that he's understood circumambulation. He's understood this basic pattern, but he thinks that you can just put anything there and you
Right.
can circumambulate. That's not how it works. It's not true. You can't put anything there. That the thing that you put in the middle has to have the quality of the middle. You can't just put any random thing in the center, because if you do, then that's going to break apart. It's going to break apart either in let's say in itself, or it's going to break apart in the fact that it's going to cause war between the different parties. Like it's going to create the pagan problem, where it's like the fight between the gods, where the gods are warring amongst themselves, and so that's the supremacy of the let's say the monotheistic tradition, is that we've come to a point where what we've put at the highest is the highest. Right? It's like we've said, okay, so this, that, it's like, okay, so these gods, and then wait, no, the God is the highest, is the origin of all. The God is the infinite, is the thing by which all things exist. And so it's not the God of war or the God of this or the God of that. No, we've brought it all into the thing by which everything exists. So it's like we're circumambulating the highest thing by its very definition, right? And that's why I always get annoyed when people like Sam Harris and them say, you're an atheist, all the believers are atheists, they're just atheists towards other gods. It's like you're being dishonest in comparing, Mars with the absolute, with the absolute transcendent God. Those two things are not the same. We're not talking about the same thing. And so I think that's maybe one of the problems with. But I mean, it's great that secular atheists have understood at least that circumambulation is the manner in which the world exists. They've kind of seen it, but they still have this flat way of looking at it.
One of the best illustrations of that I've come across recently is, who Scott Alexander is? Star Slate Codex. He has a blog. He's a psychiatrist on the East Coast. He writes pseudonymously, and he wrote a piece recently. Rod Dreher picked it up as well. It was called "Gay Rights," RITES, are civil rights, RITES. He was in Guatemala and noticed their Easter pageantry, and he compared that with kind of traditional American civil religious 4th of July parades to the Pride Parade in San Francisco. And he was making the point exactly as Jonathan Haidt does, that what these parades are doing is functionally equivalent to Jonathan Haidt's circumambulation. But what he can't see is exactly the point that you just made, that which you elevate and celebrate in your parade is not just, well, we need a glue to hold society together. The glue matters.
Yeah, it does. And there's a difference between a Paschal procession and a Pride carnival. And they appear in the very manifestation of the two. Like one looks like a carnival, one looks like a orderly procession of and so it's like you can just look at what they look like, and you can see that one is on the edge and one is actually turning around the middle. One is a clown, kind of. There's a difference between Mardi Gras and Easter. And
yes,
and we're not able to tell the difference anymore. We think we think they're the same.
Right. And I just want to say, Jonathan, I have learned so much from you, and your work, I think, is astoundingly valuable. When I first, I stumbled into this whole Jordan Peterson thing. Gosh, how did that happen? Well, it's God, of course, but then there's this Eastern Orthodox icon carver. And it's like,
random,
what?
Just random guy.
And some of the first videos I listened to you, I'm just thinking, what is he talking about? But after a while, I began to say, oh wow, I have learned so much from you, and I'm deeply grateful and indebted to your work, because and so many of these things that you have illustrated, I think, so well, have helped me see a lot. And so if there are moments that you say, why am I making these darn videos?
There are moments like that.
Talking to these random strangers and asking me, I look at the kinds of questions you're asked in your question and answer videos sometimes, and it's like, oh gosh, I'm glad. Part of the reason I haven't started a question and answer thing is like, I hope they don't ask me the kinds of questions they asked Jonathan. I don't know if I could answer them.
Yeah, my goodness.
But I'm deeply grateful for your work.
Thank you. Thanks
helped
a lot.
me so much. And so,
That's it's not only very touching, but it does, you know, to hear that from you, you know, it's very helpful. Like it's helpful, like you said, in those moments where I'm like, okay, what is going on? Like, what am I doing? I'm a YouTuber. You know, I hear my kids tell their friends that their father's a YouTuber, and I'm like, oh man.
My wife and oldest son actually have a phrase to try to make sure people don't watch my videos. They're like, well, so I hear your father's on YouTube. It's like, yeah, he does like 2-hour videos about religion and philosophy. And once people hear that, they're like, I'm never going to listen to that.
I don't want you to listen to my dad. That's hilarious. Anyways, but I'm also really impressed. I think like I'm also impressed at the fact that you've been able to kind of reach out to just the everyday listener. I don't know how you do it. Like the fact that you're able to have all these conversations with all these people that are watching your videos. It's like you're taking people on this like therapeutic reconnection, you know, taking their hand and kind of guiding them slowly towards God, towards the church, but in such a real therapeutic way. You know, it's pretty amazing. It's like hopefully all of this, like this, whatever it is that we're doing, like, you know,
whatever it is that we're doing is exactly right.
Whole discussion, this weird thing that, you know, it's like, yeah. Anyways, I let's just say that I think both of you, I'm very grateful as well. Like I'm grateful to see people come to you. And I hear people all the time, like they're like, I listen to Paul every day. And it's like, kind of like, yeah, they don't go to church yet, but it's like, Paul's my pastor. They'll say things like that, you know, but they don't go to church yet, but it's like, they kind of know that it's in their future. They kind of know it, but it's like, you know, I'll get there. But for now, you know, so I think that's awesome. I think that's great. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Well, I one of the talking, it takes a lot out of me because it's intensive listening that you have to do for people.
I don't know. I wouldn't believe that it takes a lot out of you, because it's like, if you keep going like this, though.
And this is, I mean, the crazy. So one of the guys in our meetup, you know, before Jordan came to Sacramento, he was ready to kind of kiss Jordan goodbye because he was kind of done with the whole thing. But they went to the VIP thing, and he and I had the same experience because he's a psychologist and I'm a pastor. We watched Jordan work that 160 line of VIPs who had paid to shake his hand and get their picture, and how he was able to maintain, you know, listening intensity with each person that came through that line. I know what it's like to work a line, and I can't imagine how he's able to do that. How he was able to do that on his book tour night after night. Yeah. That was phenomenal. I couldn't imagine it, because I love the conversation with randos, as they call themselves, because and here's the crazy thing about human beings. You know, they're image bearers of God. And every single person that comes to me, especially if they can just tell their story, and, you know, many of the stories I can't publish because they're too personal and it would involve parents or children or something like that. But it's a, like we said earlier, it's a holy thing that becomes holy ground where, you know, where they share the pain and the tragedies and the victories of common life. And I mean, God has been all over their lives, and they haven't recognized him sometimes or seen him. And as the great privilege of being a pastor is to steward those stories and hopefully allow others to see God through the stories of ordinary people. That's one of the things I learned from my father and his ministry, and I think he learned from his father and his ministry. So I have to figure out how to do that in a sustainable way. So.
Wow. Well, anyways, it seems like you're succeeding in my perspective, because I couldn't, like, I think that but so I think at least for sure the fact, and even if you tell me also, I didn't know that a lot of the videos you're not putting up, so it means that you're having even more conversations than the ones we're seeing. So that's pretty cool. I think that's great.
But people are image bearers of God, and even if they're far from God or can't see God anywhere, God's glory is, their life is littered with God's glory, and God is working in the things that they don't see, and it is an amazing thing when they come to a place where, suddenly they came around a corner and, oh my goodness, there's God. And it's the C.S. Lewis pantheism quote. And okay, well, what do I do now? Yeah. That's exactly right. What do you do now? When you find the burning bush, do you run away? That's a reasonable thing. When you hear the voice that says, take off your shoes, you're on holy ground. Well, the best thing to do is obey. But we're messed up creatures. We're something.
All right, Paul. I think this is the longest conversation we've had. I think we've got like almost 2 hours. So
well, I didn't want to, with everything going on in your life, I didn't want to bother you with a conversation, but I so enjoy you, Jonathan. I love your laugh. You have this weird giggle that you get to a point and
yeah. I always laugh in the worst. My problem is that I laugh in the worst possible places. Telling people, like, the reason why I did a video on laughter where I did a video, like, it's like the meaning of laughter or something, and I was pretty harsh on laughter. But I think it's also just trying to understand why I laugh when things get weird or when it gets so. So, anyways, look, I'm happy if it's enjoyable.
Yeah. So. Anyway, thank you, Jonathan. I deeply appreciate this. And yeah, you recorded it, so whatever you want to do.
Yes, I recorded it, and I think I missed like the very beginning because we started right away, and then it was like, oh wait, I need to record this. So I'll kind of see how I edit. Do you want to put it up on your channel as well?
I'd love to. Sure.
All right. So what I'll do is,
I think we have a lot of people in common, but we do have some that aren't. So we should probably both post it.
So I'll send you the link, and and so I think that'd be great.
Okay.
We can plan another future discussion, and hopefully at some point we'll speak at the same place. That'd be great.
Well, I am talking to this one church that would really love to have you out, and so then if that happens, maybe we can do some joint things. And when I talk to John Vervaeke, maybe the three of us should do a 3-way video at some point too. That could be fun.
That could be a lot of fun. Yeah, definitely. All right, Paul.
All right, Jonathan.
Have a good
Take
day.
care.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
If you enjoy the Symbolic World content, there's a lot of things you can do to help us out. If you're not subscribed, please do. Go ahead and share this to all your friends if you can. Get involved in the discussion. We have a Facebook group in which people can talk about these subjects. I will put all those links in the description. And also, if you can, please support us financially by going to my website, www.thesymbolicworld.com/support. And I also have a Patreon and a Subscribe Star. So thanks again, and I will see you soon.